It was just a one-night mistake. He's just another suit I can walk away from. You have no idea how long I've been waiting for you to walk right into my hands. Farida didn't tremble when she left that hotel room in Seoul, thinking she'd left her mistake behind. She trembled when Kang Tae-jin stepped out of the shadows of her own life and whispered the one sentence that turned her freedom into a cage. She knew something was wrong the moment she realized her landlord, her boss, and even her creditors all answered with the same unreadable face. But it wasn't until he pinned her against the cold stone of a private hallway that the truth cracked open. He wasn't just a lover. He wasn't a coincidence. And when he braced his arm above her head, boxing her in with a cold, calculated stare, not out of heat but total dominance, she finally understood that that night hadn't been an accident. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had been lured into a trap far more dangerous than she ever imagined. Welcome back to the Afro-Korean Story Space channel, besties. Today's story is dedicated to Farida. I've used your name just like you asked, so make sure to say hi in the comments if you're here. To my loyal besties, a warning. This story is so intense that if you stop halfway, you'll be up all night wondering exactly how deep this boss's obsession goes. Drop a comment right now if you're ready to see what happens when a woman who thinks she's free realizes she's been claimed from the very beginning. Farida Mensah moved through the rain-slick streets of Seoul like a woman who owned the pavement beneath her boots. Clad in her fitted black leather jacket, she felt armored against the world, a silhouette of defiance against the neon glow of the city. To anyone watching, she was the picture of hard-won independence, a survivor who had built a life on her own terms, thousands of miles away from home. She thrived on the adrenaline of the unknown, trusting her street-smart instincts to navigate the sharp edges of a foreign metropolis. In her mind, she was untouchable, a queen of her own small, resilient empire who answered to no one. Her life was a series of calculated moves and guarded silence. She took pride in her ability to blend in and stand out all at once. Her braided hair caught in the wind as she ducked into her favorite late-night spots. She believed she knew the rules of the game. Work hard, stay alert, and never let anyone get close enough to see the flicker of panic that occasionally stirred beneath her surface. Her resilience was her shield, forged through hardships that had taught her to brace herself before the blow even landed. To Farida, the city was a challenge she had already conquered, a place where she had finally found the freedom to be herself without the weight of anyone else's expectations. She loved the anonymity of the crowded streets, the way she could disappear into the pulse of the night and emerge stronger the next morning. She was the architect of her own destiny, or so she told herself every time she zipped up that leather jacket and stepped out into the cold air. There was a power in her stride, a confidence that suggested she had survived the worst and come out unbroken. She walked with her chin lifted, meeting the gaze of the world with a strength that felt permanent. In this city of millions, she was certain that she was the one pulling the strings of her own life, blissfully unaware that the stage had already been set for a much darker play. The memory of that night usually came to Farida in fragments of gold and shadow, a fever dream she had tried to bury beneath the mundane tasks of her daily life. It had begun in an upscale lounge tucked away in a corner of Gangnam, a place where the air tasted of luxury and secrets. She had gone there to celebrate a small win, feeling bold in her independence, when the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a loud change, but a heavy magnetic pull that drew her eyes toward the end of the bar. There he sat, Kang Tae-jin, looking like a man who had stepped out of a high-fashion editorial and into a world he intended to conquer. When he looked at her, the piercing eyes locked onto hers with a focus so absolute it made her breath hitch. He didn't offer a playful smile or a practiced line. He simply watched her with a dangerous calm that felt like a challenge. As he eventually moved toward her, his broad shoulders filled her vision, and the scent of his expensive cologne, something dark, woody, and undeniably masculine, wrapped around her senses like an invisible tether. She told herself she was in control, that she was just enjoying the thrill of a handsome stranger, but her body betrayed her. She felt that unmistakable flutter in her stomach, a physical response to his proximity that she tried desperately to ignore. They spoke in low tones, his deep voice vibrating against the background noise of the lounge, carrying a weight that made every word feel significant. Farida found herself drawn into his gravity, intoxicated by the calculated focus he gave her. He moved with the grace of a predator, and for the first time in her life, Farida didn't mind being the one pursued. The chemistry between them was electric, a live wire that sparked every time his hand brushed hers or his sharp jaw tilted closer to whisper into her ear. It was supposed to be a single night of surrender, a brief departure from her guarded life. She had leaned into his touch, finding a strange comfort in his muscular frame and the strength he projected. As the night blurred into the early hours of the morning, Farida believed she was making a choice. She thought she was the one deciding to let her guard down for a man who seemed like a passing comet in her sky. She had no idea that every look, every touch, and every word had been a thread in a web he had started spinning long before she ever walked through those doors. She went home thinking she had experienced a beautiful, fleeting mistake, never realizing she had actually just played her part in his masterpiece. In the weeks that followed, the independence Farida wore like a leather jacket began to feel less like a shield and more like a costume. The city of Seoul, once a map she navigated with street-smart survival, started to rearrange itself around her in ways that defied logic. It began with the small things, the strange coincidences that felt like glitches in her reality. Her student debts, once a mountain of stress that kept her awake at night, simply vanished from the digital portals. When she called the bank, a polite voice informed her the balance had been settled by an anonymous private trust, leaving her with disbelief and a lingering sense of unease. The shadows deepened at her workplace, where she was suddenly fast-tracked for a promotion she hadn't even applied for. Her braided hair felt heavy as she sat in a new glass-walled office, realizing the rules of her life had changed without her consent. It wasn't just the money or the status. It was the feeling of being curated. Every time she turned a corner in the exclusive districts of Seoul, she caught the slightest flicker of a black sedan or a familiar tailored suit disappearing into the crowd. She was a survivor, and her intelligent fear told her that she wasn't just being watched, she was being managed. A shadow seemed to follow her every move, an invisible presence that smoothed her path even as it tightened the chains around her ankles. When she tried to pay for dinner, the waiter would bow and tell her the bill was already handled by a regular patron, who preferred to remain nameless. The resilience she took such pride in started to crumble under the weight of these unwanted gifts. Farida wasn't a girl who believed in fairy tales. She knew that in the underground business circles of this city, everything came with a price. Her brown eyes scanned the streets for a face she couldn't forget, the man with steel-gray eyes and a sharp jaw who had claimed her night in Seoul. The flutter in her stomach had turned into a cold knot of dread. She was the architect of her own life, yet someone was rebuilding the house around her while she was still inside. She felt like a reluctant captive in a world she thought she had conquered, haunted by the realization that her one-night mistake had been the opening act of a much larger, more terrifying production. The illusion of Farida's sanctuary shattered the moment she heard the heavy click of her apartment lock turning from the outside. She stood frozen in her living room, her hand instinctively clutching the lapel of her leather jacket as the door swung open with a quiet, terrifying authority. Kong Tae-jin didn't knock. He simply entered, moving with the grace of a predator, into a space she thought was hers alone. He didn't look like the man from the lounge. He looked like a shadow ruler, dressed in a tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of her foyer. His presence was invasive yet composed, and the moment he stepped inside, the air in the room seemed to thicken with calculated dominance. Farida's intelligent fear flared as she watched him survey her small apartment with the calm focus of a man inspecting a prized acquisition. There was no warmth in his intense and unreadable eyes, only the certainty of a high-ranking figure accustomed to secrecy and power. He didn't say a word at first, his silence more threatening than any shout could have been, as he closed the distance between them in 3 strides. Farida backed away, her shoulders tense as she hit the wall, her resilience failing her in the face of his muscular frame and dangerous calm. This was not a lover returning for a second night. This was a mafia boss reclaiming his property. When he stopped inches from her, she could once again smell his expensive cologne, but this time the scent carried the weight of possession rather than affection. Her heart hammered against her ribs as he looked down at her, his sharp jaw set in a line of absolute control. She tried to find her voice, her parted lips trembling as she looked up at him with disbelief. She wanted to demand how he got in, to scream at him to leave, but the words died in her throat as he braced one arm against the wall above her head, effortlessly boxing her in without using any visible force. In that moment, the flutter in her stomach was replaced by the chilling realization that her life was no longer her own. He stood there, a master manipulator, who had stepped out of the shadows to finally show her the face of the man who had been pulling the strings of her reality. The silence in the room was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against Farida's chest as Kang Tae-jin closed the remaining distance between them. He moved with the grace of a predator, his muscular frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over her small living room. Farida's back hit the cold surface of the wall, her shoulders tense, as she realized there was nowhere left to retreat. He didn't rush. There was nothing emotional about his movement, only a dangerous calm that made her skin prickle with intelligent fear. He stopped just inches from her, close enough that the scent of his expensive cologne and the silver stubble on his sharp jaw became her entire world. With a slow, calculated motion, he raised his arm and braced it against the wall just above her head, effortlessly boxing her in without ever laying a finger on her. The tailored black suit he wore seemed to absorb the light, making his intense and unreadable gaze even more piercing as it locked onto her wide eyes. Farida's heart hammered against her ribs, her parted lips trembling as she struggled to maintain a shred of the resilience she had worn like armor all day. She felt the flutter in her stomach return, but it was twisted now, a dark mixture of terror and an unwanted visceral response to his calculated dominance. He loomed over her, a master manipulator who looked certain of his victory, his broad shoulders blocking out any hope of escape. "You're trembling," he remarked, his deep voice carrying a slight Korean accent that sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. Farida lifted her chin, her intelligent fear sparking into a brief flame of defiance, but the stillness in his body remained unshaken. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had planned 10 steps ahead, and was simply watching the final piece of his game fall into place. In the suffocating proximity of his invasive yet composed posture, she finally understood that her one-night mistake had been nothing more than a door he had opened for her to walk through. She was trapped in a gilded cage of his making, and as he leaned in closer, the air between them vanished, leaving only the chilling realization that her freedom had always been an illusion. Tae-jin didn't move his arm from the wall, keeping Farida pinned within the small, suffocating space his body created. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored black suit with his free hand, pulling out a thick linen envelope that looked out of place in her modest apartment. He dropped it onto the small table beside them, the sound of the heavy paper hitting the wood echoing like a gavel. His expression remained intense and unreadable, his eyes never leaving her face as he gestured for her to look. With trembling fingers, Farida reached for the envelope, her intelligent fear screaming at her to stop. Inside was a paper trail that systematically dismantled her belief in her own independence. She saw copies of her apartment's deed, transferred months ago to a holding company she now recognized as his. There were receipts for her disappeared student debts and the internal HR memos from her office, signed by board members who reported directly to him. The documents were the chains she hadn't known she was wearing, a meticulously crafted record of possession rather than affection. "You thought your life was a series of lucky breaks, Farida," he said, his deep voice low and carrying that slight Korean accent that made her pulse jump. "You thought you were surviving on your own resilience." He leaned in closer, his sharp jaw nearly touching her temple as he looked down at the evidence of his calculated dominance. Every strange coincidence was laid bare in ink and stamp. Every promotion and every settled bill was a link in a cage he had built around her long before they ever shared a bed. Farida felt the truth crack open, a wave of disbelief washing over her as she realized her one-night mistake was simply the moment she had finally walked into the trap he had finished setting months prior. She wasn't a survivor who had found a way to thrive in Seoul. She was a prized acquisition who had been carefully tended to by a master manipulator. The resilience she felt in her leather jacket evaporated, replaced by the chilling realization that she had been claimed for something far more terrifying than marriage. She looked up at him, fear mixed with disbelief in her eyes, realizing that in his world, There were no accidents, only outcomes he already owned. Farida shoved the papers back toward his chest, the rustle of the high-quality linen sounding like a desperate protest in the quiet room. She forced a laugh, though it came out jagged and thin. Her intelligent fear was still there, but her resilience was clawing its way back to the surface. She looked him dead in his intense and unreadable eyes, refusing to be reduced to just another line on his balance sheet. "So that's what this is," she spat, her voice gaining strength as she channeled her inner survivor. "A business acquisition. You're not a man, Taejin, you're an algorithm. Everything is so calculated with you. Do you ever do anything that isn't part of a 10-step plan? Or is your entire life just one big, cold chess game because you're too afraid of something you can't control?" She expected a flicker of annoyance, perhaps a tightening of his sharp jaw, but Taejin remained unervingly still. His dangerous calm didn't waver, it deepened. He leaned in even closer, the heat from his muscular frame radiating through her leather jacket, forcing her to realize how small she truly was in his shadow. "Control is not fear, Farida," he whispered, his deep voice vibrating through the very marrow of her bones. "It is the only language this world understands." He reached out not to strike, but to tuck a stray lock of her braided hair behind her ear. The gesture was terrifyingly intimate. His piercing eyes locked onto hers with an iron will that made her mockery feel like a child throwing stones at a fortress. In that gaze, she saw the shadow ruler, who had survived wars she couldn't imagine. He wasn't playing a game. He was defining the reality she lived in. "You think your words hurt because they are sharp," he continued, his thumb grazing her jawline with the calm focus of a predator who had already won. "But you are still fighting a battle that ended months ago. I didn't plan for your insults, Farida. I planned for your presence. And as you can see, you are exactly where I intended you to be." The air left her lungs. Her attempt to bait him had only served to prove his point. He wasn't a man who could be moved by petty defiance. He was a force of nature in a tailored black suit, and his piercing eyes told her that no matter how hard she fought, she was already part of his design. Her shoulders slumped just a fraction, the weight of his absolute certainty finally beginning to break her spirit. Taejin's hand dropped from the wall, but his presence didn't retreat. He turned slightly, looking out the window at the sprawling neon-lit veins of Seoul, his profile sharp and unreadable against the glass. "You think my plan was a game of vanity, Farida," he said, his voice dropping into a register that felt like a warning. "You think you were an independent queen walking these streets safely because of your own street-smart survival. But you were never walking alone." He turned back to her, his piercing eyes reflecting a cold, hard truth. "Do you remember the night at the lounge? You didn't notice the 3 men in the corner booth. Kim Taewon's men. They weren't looking for a drink. They were looking for a message to send to your father's creditors. They saw a beautiful woman with no protection, a perfect piece of leverage to be taken, used, and discarded." Farida's parted lips let out a shallow breath as the disbelief in her eyes deepened. She remembered those men now, the heavy set of their shoulders, the way the air had felt jagged near their table. "They followed you to the subway," Taejin continued, his dangerous calm intensifying. "They were 10 paces behind you when my car pulled up. That night wasn't a mistake, Farida. It was an extraction. I didn't just walk into that bar. I intercepted a hit. Every debt I paid, every promotion I secured, every shadow that followed you, it wasn't just to claim you. It was to build a fortress around you that Taewon's men couldn't breach." He stepped back into her personal space, his muscular frame once again blotting out the light. "In this city, someone always owns the streets. If it wasn't my plan keeping you breathing, you would have learned the price of survival, from men who don't use silk chains or tailored suits. They use lead and concrete." Farida felt a cold shudder ripple beneath her leather jacket. The resilience she had clung to felt like a paper shield in a thunderstorm. She had spent months thinking she was outsmarting the world, never realizing she was the prize in a war between predators. Taejin wasn't just her captor. He was the monster that had eaten all the other monsters. "So, he whispered, his sharp jaw tightening as he watched the intelligent fear finally transform into a grim understanding. Would you rather be free in a world that wants to destroy you, or protected in a world that belongs to me? Farida turned away from Taejin, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet as she walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The glittering skyline of Seoul stretched out before her, a sprawling sea of electric blues and neon purples that looked like a circuit board of power and secrets. For months, she had looked at those lights and felt like a conqueror, a woman who had successfully carved out a life in the heart of a foreign giant. Now the view felt different. Each glowing skyscraper, each moving light on the Han River, was a reminder of the vastness of the world he controlled. She felt the muscular frame of Taejin move up behind her, though he didn't touch her. His presence was a dangerous calm that filled the room, more certain than the glass between her and the drop below. Farida looked at her reflection in the window, her black leather jacket, now looking less like a shield and more like a relic of a woman who no longer existed. She wasn't a stranger in this city anymore. She wasn't an anonymous survivor drifting through the crowd. She was a claimed piece of the infrastructure, a central figure in a script written by the man standing in the shadows behind her. The city looks different when you know who owns the air you're breathing, doesn't it? Taejin's deep voice was a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the hum of the city. Farida didn't answer immediately. She watched the reflection of his intense and unreadable eyes as they locked onto hers through the glass. The intelligent fear was still there, but it was being replaced by a heavy, shimmering acceptance. The chains he had placed on her weren't made of iron. They were made of safety, debt, and a calculated obsession that she could no longer deny. She realized that walking out of this room wouldn't mean freedom. It would mean walking back into the crosshairs of the enemies he had spent months shielding her from. Her parted lips let out a slow, steady breath that fogged the glass. She was no longer the architect of her own life, but there was a dark, terrifying thrill in knowing she was the only thing in this entire glittering skyline that a man like Kong Taejin truly wanted to possess. As he finally placed a hand on the window beside her head, boxing her in one last time against the backdrop of his empire, Farida closed her eyes. She had been caught in a gilded trap, and for the first time since arriving in Seoul, she stopped trying to find the exit. She was exactly where he had planned for her to be, and as the city lights twinkled in her wide eyes, she finally accepted her role as the queen of his shadow world.